The coldest kitchens in England belonged to houses where warmth had been deliberately withheld, not by the weather, but by the people inside them. Snow had been pressing against the windows of Ashvale Manor for 3 days without ceasing, and the kitchen passage smelled of tallow smoke and something scorched beyond recovery. Isolde Vane pushed through the narrow servant's door at 5:30 in the morning with a canvas bag over one shoulder and the particular stillness of a person who had long since stopped expecting anyone to hold a door for her. The cold followed her in like a second shadow. She set the bag down on the stone-flagged floor, looked at the hearth, dead, gray, not a single coal left over from the previous night, and said nothing at all. She simply knelt, opened the grate, and began to build it herself. The house was the Countess of Bracknell's, which was to say it belonged, in practical terms, to the Countess's temper. The position of cook had come open 3 weeks ago under circumstances the agency had described as a misunderstanding, and which Isolde, having spoken to the previous occupant in a corridor outside the agency office, understood to be something considerably plainer. The woman had seasoned the soup incorrectly once. The Countess had thrown the tureen. Isolde had taken the post anyway. She had £17 and 4 shillings remaining from the sale of her father's books, and the winter was not going to shorten itself on her behalf. By 6 o'clock, the hearth was burning cleanly, and she had taken stock of the larder. The state of it was a kind of financial confession, a household spending money it did not have on the impression of abundance, buying expensive cuts and then wasting them through neglect. There were 2 pheasants going soft, a half-wheel of good Stilton, with the rind dried to leather, a cold saddle of mutton from 2 nights prior that no one had thought to press into anything useful. Isolde stood with her hands on her hips and mapped a menu in her head the way her father had once taught her to audit a set of accounts, systematically, without sentiment, finding the hidden value in what had been dismissed. Her father had been a solicitor in Bath, not a grand one, not a fashionable one, but precise and meticulous, the kind of man who kept every receipt in labeled order and who read to her from Blackstone on winter evenings as if it were bedtime poetry. He had died 22 months ago. She had been given 4 days to vacate the house and had spent 3 of them settling his outstanding obligations, because she was her father's daughter and she did not know any other way to conduct herself. She had not cried. There had not been time, and then after a while, the not crying had become its own habit. A callus formed over something she suspected was still quite raw underneath. She did not think of him in the mornings. Mornings were for working. The first kitchen maid appeared at 6:30, a red-cheeked girl named Dotty, who looked alarmed to find the range already lit, and a stranger standing at the worktop with a knife in her hand. Isolde handed her a list of tasks without preamble, and the girl took it and read it twice and said nothing, which was sensible. By 7 o'clock, 2 more maids had arrived, and by 8, the first service of the day, a tray for the upstairs breakfast room, went out precisely on time, which it apparently had not done since October. The Countess of Bracknell appeared in the kitchen doorway at 9 o'clock. She did not often come to the kitchen. Isolde understood from the quality of attention that went rigid around her when she appeared that this was a notable event, and not a pleasant one. The Countess was perhaps 55, powdered with the particular care of a woman at war with her own age, her mouth set in an expression of permanent, low-level dissatisfaction. She looked at Isolde the way one looks at furniture that has been arranged incorrectly. "You are the new cook," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, my lady." "You come from the Halstow agency." "Yes, my lady." The Countess moved to the worktop and lifted the lid from a pot Isolde had on a gentle simmer, a pheasant broth, dark and serious, with a bundle of thyme. She let the steam hit her face, replaced the lid, and said, "My nephew arrives this afternoon. He requires dinner at 8. He is exacting about his table." "Understood, my lady." "He is the Duke of Ardenvale." The Countess said it the way a person drops a stone into still water, watching for the ripple. "You will have heard of him." Isolde had heard of him. Most of England had heard of him. The Duke of Ardenvale was called the Grey Wolf in the political press, less because of anything lupine, and more because of the quality of his patience, which was reportedly absolute and reportedly dangerous. He had a dukedom worth perhaps £90,000 a year. He sat in the Lords and rarely spoke, but when he did, legislation moved. He was 38 years old and had been a widower for 6 years, and had, by all accounts, no interest whatsoever in replacing what he had lost. "Yes, my lady," Isolde said. 8 o'clock. I will be prepared." The Countess looked at her a moment longer than was necessary. "The last cook burned his cutlets." "I will not burn his cutlets." The Countess left. Dottie let out a long breath that she had apparently been holding for some time. Isolde went back to her broth. He arrived at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. She did not see him arrive. She heard him, or rather, she heard the particular quality of silence that followed the sound of a carriage on the gravel drive, the kind of silence that a household produces when something has entered it that commands a recalibration of every person inside. Even the kitchen felt it. Dottie stopped stirring. The second maid, whose name was Pearl, looked up from the pastry she was rolling and listened to the ceiling as if it might tell her something. Then there were footsteps in the passage above, steady and unhurried, the footsteps of a man who had never learned to soften his weight for anyone else's comfort. Isolde did not look up from the sauce she was mounting. Butter, drawn off in cold pieces, folded in one at a time, an act requiring attention that admitted no interruption. She held the pan's angle, kept the heat where she needed it, and thought about nothing except the rate at which the emulsion was forming. She did not go upstairs. She did not intend to go upstairs. At 3:30, the butler appeared in the kitchen doorway. His name was Griggs, a tall, spare man whose face had the compressed neutrality of someone who had worked for the Countess for many years and endured it. "His Grace has requested to see the kitchen," he said. Isolde looked up at him. "The kitchen," she repeated. "The kitchen." Griggs's expression did not change, though something moved through his eyes that might have been faint apology. He does so on occasion, when he stays. He likes to know what he is eating. She had not changed. She was wearing her working dress, a plain gray wool, with a canvas apron over it, and a smear of something on her left cuff that was either stock or rendered butter. Her hair was up, but just barely, in the functional way of someone who valued containment over appearance. She looked exactly like what she was. "Very well," she said. She wiped her hands and stood. He came in without announcement, which was itself a kind of statement. He filled the doorframe, not in any theatrical way, not in the way of a man performing his own size, but simply because he was a large person, who moved like someone who had never needed to make himself smaller. Dark wool coat, still carrying the cold of the outdoors. A cravat tied without particular decoration, gray at his temples, which she had not expected, and a face that was strongly made, not handsome in any comfortable way, but striking in the way of things built for use rather than display. He looked at the kitchen with pale, serious eyes the color of winter sky, and the kitchen did not look back so much as simply receive him, the way a room receives a change in atmospheric pressure. Every one of the maids had gone still. He looked at the pans on the range. He looked at the worktop, at the state of the mise en place, at the pheasant broth still on its low heat. He moved to the worktop and looked at the evening service plan, which Isolde had written out on a sheet of paper and pinned to the board beside the range. Then he looked at her. "You wrote this," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." A silence. He read the menu again. "The pheasant broth is from this morning's birds? 2 days on the soft side, Your Grace. Today was the last day they were worth using. And the saddle of mutton, pressed cold with juniper and served alongside the first remove. I will not present it as fresh. The flavor will carry, if the preparation is correct." He said nothing for a moment. He was looking at her the way he had looked at the menu, not appraisingly, not with condescension, but with the specific attention of someone taking in information they consider worth having. "Thank you," he said. It was quiet enough in the kitchen that she heard Pearl, behind her, stop breathing. Griggs, in the doorway, went very slightly rigid. No one said anything. Hale, the Duke of Ardenvale, turned and left the kitchen the way he had entered it, unhurried, without ceremony. The sound of his footsteps moved back down the passage and up the stairs, and the kitchen resumed its breath. Dottie looked at Isolde with very wide eyes. "He said thank you," she whispered. "He did," said Isolde, and went back to her sauce. She learned, over the next 4 days, why the kitchen had reacted that way. Griggs was not a man who gossiped. He was, however, a man who supplied necessary context when a household's functioning required it, and on the morning of the second day, He appeared at the kitchen door while she was doing her accounts and stood there until she looked up. "His Grace has not expressed gratitude in this house in some years," he said. "His last visit was at Christmas. He did not thank the former cook once in 11 days. He thanked me for describing the state of the larder accurately," Isolde said. "Quite," said Griggs, and left. She filed this away under things that were interesting but not relevant to her immediate situation, alongside the fact that the Countess appeared to be approximately £400 in debt to a merchant in Mayfair and was in the habit of intercepting correspondence she did not want her nephew to receive. This last piece of information came to Isolde obliquely, through the pattern of what household bills were presented at which times, and which of the kitchen deliveries came with secondary documentation that seemed to belong to an entirely different set of accounts. She was her father's daughter. She noticed these things the way other people noticed weather. Hale came to the kitchen again on the third morning. She did not know he was there until she turned from the hearth and found him standing just inside the doorway, alone, without Griggs, in the kind of silence that suggested he had been there for a moment already. He was holding a piece of paper. She recognized it as the sheet she had pinned beside the range, not the menu, the other one, the one on which she had begun to reconstruct the household accounts as she understood them, more from habit than intention, because she had been trained to see numbers in a certain way and could not simply unsee them. She went still. He held the paper. He did not hold it as a person holds evidence they intend to use against someone. He held it the way her father used to hold a document he found interesting. "You have identified an error," he said. "I did not intend." She stopped. She was not going to apologize for her own competence. "I noticed it," she said instead. "The quantities in the merchant's invoices do not match the kitchen receipts for the same periods. The variance over 6 months is approximately £340. 342, he said. She looked at him. "I have my own ledger," he said. "I have been looking at this for some months. I was waiting to see if the discrepancy resolved itself." He set the paper on the worktop and looked at her directly for the first time since he had entered. "It has not resolved itself." There was a quality to his voice. Not anger, or not only anger, something else. The particular tone of a man who has been watching something wrong continue for a long time and has reached the end of whatever patience he was applying to it. "You understand," she said carefully, "that it is not my place to—" "You understand it perfectly well," he said. "That is why you wrote it down." She was quiet. "Where is the rest of it?" he said. She hesitated for only a moment. Then she went to the kitchen drawer where she kept her own working notes. The ones she had told herself were just for her own reference, just the habit of a trained eye, and she put them on the worktop beside the first sheet. 6 weeks of kitchen deliveries. Discrepancies rendered in her father's notation style, tidy, unambiguous, adding to something that could not be coincidence and was not a rounding error. He read them. He read them without speaking for nearly 2 full minutes, which was a long time to stand in a kitchen with a duke reading your private notes in silence. She occupied herself by checking the heat on the range. Her hands were steady. She was aware of them being steady, and was quietly grateful for it. "Thank you," he said again when he looked up. It was different from the first time. The first time it had been the automatic gratitude of a man with exacting standards who had received competence he had not expected. This time it was something more specific, a recognition, the acknowledgement of one precise thinker by another. She thought of her father, briefly and without warning, and the thought came and went before she could prevent it, carrying with it the familiar weight of everything she had not had time to put down. She kept her expression level. "What will you do?" she asked. "What needs to be done?" he said, and left. The afternoon of the 4th day settled over Ashvale Manor, with the particular tension of weather before it breaks. Snow again, a fine, mean kind, driving sideways past the kitchen windows in sheets. Isolde was at the worktop assembling a cold supper for 8 when she heard voices in the passage. Not the careful, muffled voices of servants, but full-volume, upper-class voices that had never been asked to moderate themselves and didn't intend to start. The Countess's voice, high and carrying, with a distinctive quality of outrage that had been refined over decades. And another voice, lower, that Isolde identified after a moment as belonging to a man named Lord Fenwick, who had arrived that morning as an additional guest, and whose manner at the table the previous evening had been the kind of elaborately gracious she associated with people who needed something. The words were not quite clear through the passage wall, but the shape of them was. The Countess was alarmed. Lord Fenwick was appeasing. Someone else's name came through, Hale's name, and then a silence that felt like the silence before a decision, rather than after one. Isolde went back to the cold supper. 20 minutes later, Griggs appeared. "His Grace has asked you to attend him in the library," he said, and his voice had the careful neutrality of a man who has seen the house shift beneath his feet and is choosing his steps. She took off her apron. She smoothed her dress, which was still the plain gray wool because she did not own a different one. She followed Griggs. The library was warm, which surprised her. The rest of the house ran cold. The Countess kept the fires banked as a matter of economy. Here the fire had been built high, throwing orange light across the shelves, and the smell of it was brandy and cedar and old books, which was a smell she associated with her father's study and which she did not allow to affect her. Hale was standing at the window with his back to the room. The Countess was seated in the chair nearest the fire, very upright, with 2 spots of color in her powdered cheeks that had nothing to do with warmth. Lord Fenwick stood beside the mantelpiece, in the practiced posture of a man who has decided that if he looks relaxed, the situation will follow. There was another man in the room. Young, dark-coated, with a leather case that contained, she suspected, documents. No one spoke when she entered. Hale turned from the window. He did not look at the Countess. He did not look at Lord Fenwick. He looked at Isolde with those winter-pale eyes and said, "Will you describe what you found in the kitchen accounts, please?" "Exactly as you described it to me." The Countess made a sound. Lord Fenwick said, "Surely this is entirely irregular. A cook, of all people." "The amounts," Hale said to Isolde, as if Fenwick had not spoken. She was aware that this was a choice. She was aware that she was being asked to perform an act that would have consequences she could not entirely predict, that it was not her battle, and that she had a position here which depended on the goodwill of the Countess, who was currently looking at her with an expression that was pure, refined ice. She was also aware that 342 pounds had been moved somewhere it was not supposed to go, and that she was her father's daughter, and that she did not look away from correct numbers in order to spare the feelings of people who had made them incorrect. "The kitchen invoices from the Mayfair merchant," she said, "show consistent overbilling of between 12 and 19% across 16 weeks of deliveries. The signed receipts held in the kitchen, which are the copies retained by the household rather than the merchant, have been altered, the original amounts partially overwritten. I can identify the alteration because the ink color is different, and the pen pressure inconsistent." She paused. "The total discrepancy across the period I examined is 342 pounds. The corrected figure may be higher. I only audited the kitchen accounts. I did not have access to the rest." The young man with the leather case opened it. Lord Fenwick stepped forward. "This is an extraordinary overreach." "Sit down," said Hale. He had not raised his voice. He did not need to. Lord Fenwick sat down. What happened next took approximately 35 minutes and was, Isolde thought, a lesson in the specific kind of power that operates without any theater whatsoever. Hale did not shout. He did not threaten. He produced, through the young man with the leather case, a set of documents that demonstrated that the overbilling scheme had been running for 2 years, not 6 months, and that the funds had been directed in part to Lord Fenwick, who had until recently been the Countess's man of business, and who had apparently helped himself to something in the range of 800 pounds of her money before beginning to cover his absence with the altered receipts. The Countess's expression moved through several phases during this presentation. Outrage, disbelief, a particular kind of awful, small crumpling that was the expression of a woman realizing that the person she had trusted most in her financial affairs had been stealing from her. She said nothing, in the end. She sat very still and looked at the fire. Lord Fenwick produced 3 different explanations before he stopped producing explanations. The young man from the solicitor's firm, he was a solicitor's clerk, it transpired, wrote everything down in a clean, steady hand that reminded Isolde acutely of her father's handwriting, and her throat closed briefly around something she did not have time for, and she breathed past it. "You will make full restitution," Hale said to Fenwick, "or the matter goes to the magistrate before the week is out. That is the only negotiation you are being offered." He paused. "I recommend you do not test whether I mean it." Lord Fenwick, by this point, had the gray, diminished look of a man who has run out of the performance that has been sustaining him. He said he would need time. "A fortnight," said Hale. "Griggs will show you out now." After Fenwick was gone, there was a silence in the library broken only by the fire. The Countess sat with her hands in her lap and did not look at Isolde. Hale stood at the window again. The clerk packed his case quietly. "How long?" said the Countess at last, to no one in particular, or perhaps to the fire. "Has it been going on?" 2 years, said Hale. "I see." She was quiet for a moment. "I see." Isolde had not moved from where she was standing near the door. She was trying to determine whether she was still needed or whether she had become furniture again, the kind of furniture that has served its purpose and may now be returned to its customary location. "Miss Vane," said Hale. She looked at him. "You should know," he said, "that the question of what to do with what you found was yours to resolve. You could have said nothing." "Yes," she agreed. "I could have." "Why didn't you?" She considered the question seriously, which was the only way she knew how to consider questions. "Because my father was a solicitor who spent 30 years correcting other people's arithmetic errors so that those errors didn't compound into something worse. And because I am made of what he taught me, and I could not look at incorrect numbers and simply leave them that way." The Countess made a small sound, not contempt, something more tired than that. Hale looked at Isolde for a moment that held more information than she knew what to do with. Then he said, "That will be all for this evening. Thank you." She left. She did not know, until she reached the kitchen, and Dottie looked at her with enormous frightened eyes and asked her what had happened upstairs, that her hands had been shaking. She pressed them flat on the worktop and concentrated on the cold supper until they stopped. The days that followed moved strangely, with the quality of a held breath slowly being released. Lord Fenwick departed Ashvale Manor the following morning in a carriage that left before the household was fully awake. The Countess took her meals in her room for 2 days and then appeared at the table on the third, with her face composed and her spine very straight, which Isolde recognized as the posture of a woman rebuilding from something she was not going to discuss. The kitchen continued. The range burned. The menus came and went. On the 7th day, Hale's carriage should have been called for. On the 8th day, it still had not been. On the 12th day, Isolde was in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, working through the week's accounts, the real ones, neat and correct, because the Countess had asked her, with characteristic economy of manner, to handle the household receipts going forward, when Griggs appeared and said, "His Grace asks if you are free this morning." She set down her pen. "Free," she repeated. "At your convenience, I believe," was the phrase he used. She found him in the library again, but differently this time. The formality had gone out of it. He was sitting at the writing desk with a book open, and he turned when she came in and stood. He was dressed simply, without the formal coat, which felt like a statement although she could not have said what kind. He gestured to the chair across from the desk. She sat. He sat. There was a pause that was not uncomfortable, which was unusual. Uncomfortable silence she was accustomed to. This was something different. The silence of two people who have established, through a shared act, that they can be trusted with each other's information, and who are now deciding what to do with that. "I spoke with my solicitor yesterday," he said. "Fenwick's restitution has been agreed. My aunt will recover what was taken." "I am glad," Isolde said. "You made it possible." He said it directly, without ornament, the way he seemed to say most things. "I had the suspicion, and some portion of the documentation. I lacked the specific evidence from the household records that would make the case inarguable. You provided it." She waited. "I am returning to Ardenvale in 4 days," he said. "It is my principal estate, in Northumberland. The journey is approximately 2 days by road." Now, she was not sure what to say to this, so she said nothing. "I have a household there of 42 people," he said, "including a cook who has been with me for 11 years, and who is excellent, and whom I have no intention of replacing." He paused. "What I do not have is anyone whose primary task is the management of the household accounts. My secretary handles the estate accounts, which are a different matter. The household accounts have been managed informally, which is to say not well." Isolde was quiet for a moment. "You are offering me a position," she said. "I am offering you a specific position. Household comptroller. A formal title and a formal wage. I would suggest £40 per annum, though I am open to discussion on the figure, if you consider it insufficient." £40 per annum was twice what she was earning as the Countess's cook. It was also, she noted with the particular part of her mind that could not stop counting, almost enough to have purchased her father's house outright, if she had had it 2 years ago. She was aware that this could be looked at several ways, only some of which were straightforward. She was aware that she had spent the last 12 days cooking for this man and auditing his aunt's accounts, and telling his solicitor's clerk exactly what she had found in the kitchen receipts, and that in all of that, she had not once felt the particular, degrading helplessness she had felt in other houses when she was merely a person required to produce food and be invisible. She had felt, she realized, like her father's daughter, like someone whose precision was the point rather than an inconvenience. She was also aware that she was sitting across from a man who had said thank you to her twice in 12 days, and that this was apparently unprecedented enough to have alarmed his aunt's entire domestic staff. "I have a question," she said. "Yes. You have not asked me for references." Something moved through his expression, not quite a smile. The near cousin of a smile, the trace element. "I have read your arithmetic," he said. "That is the reference I find most useful." She looked at him directly, which she had been doing since the first day, because she had discovered early that people who looked at her directly generally received more honest answers than people who didn't. "And if I find further irregularities in the Ardenvale household accounts, if the numbers do not resolve correctly, I will tell you what I find. I am not built to look the other way." "I know," he said. "That is why I am asking you." She thought about Northumberland, which she had never seen. She thought about 2 days' road north into country she had no map for, in service to a man who was famous for his silence and his patience and whatever it was that had made the newspapers call him the Grey Wolf, which she suspected had more to do with the quality of his attention than any appetite for aggression. She thought about £40 per annum and a formal title, and the household accounts of a dukedom, which would be, she had no doubt, considerably more interesting than pheasant broth and altered receipts. She thought about her father's ledger notation, the one she had used for the kitchen accounts, which was also the one she had used to identify Lord Fenwick's theft, and the way it sat in her handwriting now, the only inheritance she carried with her every day, as portable as thought. £40, she said, is insufficient. He waited. 50, she said. Given that your household is 42 people, which is a considerably larger audit scope than what I have been managing here. The trace element returned to his expression and held. 50, he agreed, and the position is permanent, not conditional. And I report directly to you on the accounts, not through the secretary. Agreed. And I retain the right to refuse any task that is not within the scope of what we have agreed. That, he said, is not a condition I would expect to need to be stated. Nevertheless, he agreed. Accepted. She held out her hand. He looked at it for just a moment, not with surprise exactly, but with the quality of attention he brought to everything, reading it before responding. Then he took it, and they shook, and it was the precise handshake of two people entering a professional arrangement whose terms have been negotiated fairly and recorded nowhere except in their own clear understanding. His hand was warm and considerably larger than hers, and the grip was exactly right, firm, brief, unambiguous, and she released it and stood, because there was still a household behind her that needed running, and 4 days before his carriage left for Northumberland. I will need 2 days to conclude my responsibilities to the Countess, she said. Take 3, he said. She nodded once and went back to the kitchen. She told Dottie that afternoon, because Dottie would find out anyway, and because the girl had been kind to her in the small ways that people in service are kind when they are good-hearted. A cup left warming on the range, a task assumed without being asked. Dottie's face went through several expressions in quick succession before landing on something that was mostly happiness for her and partly bereft for herself, which Isolde understood to be the genuine article. "Is it true he never smiles?" Dottie asked. "I have no empirical evidence either way," said Isolde, which was not quite the same as saying no. The 3 days passed. The Countess summoned her on the second morning and looked at her for a long moment across the sitting room. 2 women standing in an uncomfortable space, one who had power and had been diminished by the misuse of it, one who had none and had been asked to use it anyway. The Countess said, "You handled yourself well." She said it the way people say things they find slightly difficult to say, which is to say without embellishment or repetition. She did not say anything else, and Isolde did not need her to. The carriage left Ashvale Manor on a clear morning, the snow finally gone, the ground hard and pale with frost, the air sharp enough to taste like something metallic at the back of the throat. Isolde sat on the forward-facing bench with a bag containing everything she owned and a leather case containing the household account ledgers she had been given to begin reviewing en route, because she had asked for them, and Hale had produced them without commentary, which was the most efficient thing that had happened to her in recent memory. He sat across from her reading correspondence. He had said good morning and asked if she had sufficient light. She had said yes and opened the first ledger. They were perhaps an hour north of the manor when he said, without looking up from his correspondence, "My estate manager has been with Ardenvale for 19 years. He will not be delighted by the appointment of a household comptroller." "No," she agreed, still reading. "He is competent," Hale said. "Merely territorial." "Most competent people are territorial," said Isolde. "It is not a problem. It is only a conversation." A pause. "You have managed difficult people before," he said. "Not a question." "I have been a cook in houses where difficult people considered me invisible," she said. "That is a useful vantage point. You hear things clearly when people do not believe you are listening." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at her without looking up herself. "What do you hear," he said, "when people think you are not listening?" She finally raised her eyes from the ledger. He was watching her with that pale, precise attention, and it occurred to her, not for the first time, that this was a man who asked questions he already knew the shape of, who waited to see how a person filled the shape in. "The truth," she said, "people perform for audiences. They do not perform for furniture, and for a very long time I was furniture." He said nothing for a moment. The carriage moved through bare-branched country, the morning light flat and silver across the fields. "You are not furniture," he said. He said it the way he said everything, without ornament, in the tone of a statement whose accuracy he had already verified. She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "I have always known. It was other people who required the correction." Something shifted in his face. Not the trace element this time. Something more definite. Something she decided to look away from for now. Not because it frightened her, but because she was still reading a ledger, and the conversation could wait. There was time. They had 2 days on the road, and £50 per annum, and the accounts of an entire northern dukedom to examine together, and neither of them was going anywhere. She went back to the ledger. He went back to his correspondence. The carriage rolled north, through the frost-pale fields, and the morning opened around them with the quiet, industrious quality of something beginning properly, rather than starting over. There is a certain kind of woman who has been told for years that her precision is an inconvenience, that her clear eye and her steady hand are qualities suited to lesser rooms and lesser occupations, that the numbers she sees correctly and corrects without sentiment are not the kind of work that merits recognition. And then there is a certain kind of man who has been told for years that his silence is coldness, his patience is arrogance, his exacting standards a form of cruelty, who has learned to hold everyone at a distance, because nearness has cost him things he was not recovered from. What happens when those 2 people find, in the back of a carriage with a ledger between them, that they are looking at the same numbers and reaching the same conclusions, not just about accounts, but about what they require from the world and what they are prepared to offer it? Perhaps you already know. Perhaps you have been the woman with the ledger, or have loved her, or have been the man across the carriage who said thank you twice and meant both of them differently. The story does not end in a library, or a carriage, or even at the gates of a great northern estate, glimpsed for the first time through frost-silvered glass. It ends later, and quieter, in the specific moment when a partnership becomes something that neither person has a tidy word for, and neither needs one. The moment when Hale took the ledger from Isolde's hands to hold the light for her at the window, and she let him, and he stayed.